Dodge rolling is one of the main mechanics of any good Souls-like. I'd say it's a pretty good defensive option, but in a certain scenario it also happens to be one of the worst offensive options in the entire game. This is the Briar Armor, a unique set of armor that allows you to do damage to an enemy by simply rolling into them. This damage doesn't scale, doesn't apply status effects, and can't be upgraded in any way outside of specific spells or talismans that just so happen to increase your damage. 2 years ago, despite those issues, I decided to torture myself by doing a challenge run where the only form of attack I was allowed to use was this Briar Armor roll damage. If I'm being completely honest though, I never really expected it to work. Before that run, I never considered myself to be any good at Souls games, and if you went back to take a look at my very first run, the shield-only challenge run, you might be able to see how clumsily I was making my way through the game as a rookie to this genre. But as I kept playing, I began to see the possibility of success. Each boss I took down reinforced the idea that FromSoft is generally pretty great at designing fair boss fights, despite how insane they might look at first glance. Once you know what to look for, you begin to see openings and opportunities that might have been invisible to you before, and over the many hours I spent rolling into these bosses, learning every little nuance to their combos and every little twitch that betrayed their intentions, I gained so much respect and appreciation for the way that From designs their fights. Except for these two. But Shadow of the Erdtree is here now, and it's chock full of notoriously difficult bosses. More health, more defense, and more aggression. Luckily for us, we also get a few new tools to balance things out. So the question is it possible? I mean, yeah, at this point that question is silly because somebody's gonna be crazy enough to pull it off. But can I do it? Can I do it? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's get this run started. As is tradition at this point, it seems that I forgot to do something to unlock the DLC on this character too. I released a whole video detailing my experience of rolling Moog to death, but in both that video and in the original run, I forgot to take down the rotting general himself, Starscourge Radahn. Don't worry, I'll keep this brief. Not only is Radahn old content, but he also just barely qualifies as early mid-game content. I leveled up a lot and collected a lot of tools to prepare myself for Elden Ring's endgame, so I'm pretty well stocked at this point with a pretty optimized build for this playstyle. That means Radahn doesn't hit me very hard at all, which is actually kinda nice because I'm rusty at this fight and I'm eager to make it to the Shadowlands. At under 10,000 health, he doesn't take very long to kill either. It's really just a matter of getting used to his weirdly long delayed attacks and his constant motion. But he generally, get it, leaves plenty of space to allow me to cast my heal over time spell, Bestial Vitality, basically whenever I need it. I was also kind of absent-minded going into this fight and left Moog's anti-curse tier on my Wondrous Physic, which resulted in a bit of lost healing. But it didn't really matter in the end anyway. Radahn hits like a wet noodle compared to what I've already dealt with prior to him, so despite an extremely sloppy fight and almost running out of flasks, I actually managed to kill Radahn on my first try. Time to beat, 21 minutes and 28 seconds. I want you to remember this time to beat, because I think it's going to be very interesting at the end of this video. Until then, let's resume the game that we played in the first two Briar Armor videos. As I introduce each boss, I want you to write down your guess for how long you think it'll take for me to beat it, and then share your guesses in a comment at the end. There's no prize for being right, I just think it's fun to see everyone's guesses, so please, no cheating, there's no point. Anyway, that Radahn fight sure was a nice warm-up. I sure hope he doesn't somehow get a second chance to embarrass me.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
I head back to Moog's palace and grab the desiccated hand of a dead Empyrean to be transported to the Land of Shadow and begin an extended period of doing chores. I know going into this that this is going to be a very difficult challenge. I'm not going to be honorable like I was in my previous challenges by limiting myself to Shadow Tree fragments that I found in the immediate area. I'm going to grab as many fragments as I possibly can before even daring to challenge the easiest of bosses that this expansion has to offer. Yes, I'm scared, I'll admit it. After 2 challenge runs, this DLC still frightens me. The main challenge with collecting Shadow Tree fragments is just knowing where they are. At this point, I have their locations mostly memorized, so it's just a matter of hitting every point of interest that I can, but there's a few notable challenges along the way. Chief among them is FromSoft's devious little plot of hiding fragments in the corpses of these goofy little potheads in 4 different places. I didn't expect for this to work on the first try, but I was able to dive off my horse and ram myself into this dude on the east side of Graveside Plain until he died, scoring me a fragment. I didn't expect this to work because these dudes are this game's crystal lizards, and they'll teleport away if you leave them alone. Luckily, even the smallest hit seems to stop that from happening, but it's still a pretty tense game of trying to avoid getting hit and body blocked by everything else in the area while I chase my quarry. The second pothead on the plateau on the west side of Graveside Plain doesn't go so well.
Ow! Stupid dog, you made me look bad.
After that embarrassing display, I'd take a bit of a detour. I know that this plateau houses our first new tool for this run, the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman. So I head in the direction where I think I remember that being. So while I get my revenge and collect more fragments, allow me to explain what this actually is. There are precious few ways in Elden Ring to refill your FP bar, and even fewer that aren't tied to some kind of consumable resource. For the cost of a talisman slot, this baby will restore your FP passively over time at a rate of 1 point per 2 seconds, or 30 points per minute. This doesn't sound like a lot, and it really isn't. But bear in mind that right now, the only spell that I bother casting is Bestial Vitality, and that only costs 18 FP and lasts for 2 minutes. I was only carrying 1 blue flask anyway, but this talisman allows me to not have to worry about running out of FP ever again, and I can regain one of my red flasks. Honestly, not a bad deal. But if Bestial Vitality was the only reason to use this talisman, it probably wouldn't be worth the slot, but just you wait. Anyway, I finish collecting all the easily available fragments in Graveside Plain, and then head towards the Spirit Spring shortcut to bypass Castle Ensis and land straight on the plateau. Well, kinda. I think it's possible to avoid landing inside this fort and getting dismounted, but I wasn't ready and was forced to walk my way out of here. It's not all bad though, because I know that this fort houses the Flame Drake Talisman +3, which I probably want for later. So I grab that and get back to collecting all the tasty shadow snacks littered around Shadow Altus. Once I've gathered most of them, I pump my blessing level to +9 before taking on Shadow Altus' own Shadowhead, which proves to be more annoying than the previous 2 because of one of those Cirque du Soleil guys bouncing around trying to protect them. The guy almost got away, but I managed to get the kill and flee to Bonnie Village for a pose, and then made my way north to the Freaky Fingy Church for an old man's used whistle, before heading even further north to the church district of Shadow Keep. I'm here for a very specific reason, because this area houses the second new tool that we'll be making use of for this DLC run. Gathering it's going to be a challenge though, but before even thinking about that, I've got to pull the plug on this oversized bathtub. So I head across the rooftops and—
Fuck! What was that?
I said I head across the rooftops into the church and back outside to gain access to the lower part of the district where our target lives. Geez, some people can be so rude. Oh look, new boss cards. This time I included the BL stat, which is my blessing level. And in case you forgot, RTK stands for rolls to kill and DPR is damage per roll. I was always going to collect Shadow Tree fragments for their defensive benefits, but fortunately they also increase the amount of damage that I deal with the Briar Armor. So this stat is relevant since it changes the amount of damage that I'm able to do to my enemies. Anyway, this seemingly unimportant field boss is hiding a little spell that might help us out over the rest of the DLC, and I don't really want to move forward without it, so we're in for a fight. Luckily, this field boss is an old friend from the base game. The Ulcerated Tree Spirit is one of those bosses that looks extremely intimidating and difficult to read, but once you start to learn how it operates, it's not too difficult to read and dodge. At least, that's my take for literally any weapon that's not the Briar Armor. Fights with the Briar Armor last so long that attacks that are difficult to dodge become a much more dramatic situation than they otherwise would be. Sure, with normal weapons, these attacks can still be pretty dangerous, but at least you have the damage potential to put the enemy down for good before it has the opportunity to use that attack enough times to kill you. But with such low damage, these dangerous attacks are upgraded to an existential threat. Many bosses have these attacks, and the ulcerated tree spirit is no exception. This thing has 2 phases, and will enter phase 2 at roughly 60%. This is marked with the holy explosion, and from here on out, the boss will start doing holy damage along with its normal attacks and gain some new offensive capabilities. That holy explosion that marked the phase transition is one of those new attacks, and the attack that is horrifically difficult to avoid. I don't think this explosion is avoidable with dodge frames alone, cause I was never able to actually pull it off. Your best bet is to run the hell away as soon as it shows signs that it wants to explode, but when you're throwing your body into it like a dog that shows love by sitting on your foot, it's hard to have the time to be able to get away. I got hit by nearly every one of these explosions, managing to get away from just 1 or 2. You've got to react quickly to get out, and with how recklessly I was spamming the roll button due to my own impatience, that was difficult to do, especially with how small this arena is and how difficult it can be to navigate. The explosion seems to do about 40% of my health and damage, and aside from the easy-to-dodge grab attack, I think that this is the most damaging thing that this boss is capable of. Now, if I was the most patient, perfectly sensible human being in the world, I could make use of this boss's biggest weakness in the fact that it's an open-world boss, with an extremely limited tether range, to make this a free win. No matter how much damage I take, I can just run away and heal up without losing any unrecoverable resources. Between Bestial Vitality, the Icon Shield, and the Blessed Dew Talisman, I can regenerate 10 health per second, and with the Blessed Blue, I can use Bestial Vitality an infinite number of times. Anytime I get hit, I can just run off, wait, and then run back in, which I do a couple of times, but I'm not quite that patient. What can I say? Sometimes I'm a weak little man. And we'll see how that bites me a bit later, but first, let me show you the other weakness of being an outdoor open-world boss. I know that large enemies tend to cause some collateral damage, and as luck would have it, there's a bunch of giant crabs infesting this area. I can lure them into the tree spirit, and if I'm lucky, the crab will deal a significant amount of damage to the spirit as it tries to murder me. The tree spirit is just as uncaring as the crab is, however, and the crab eventually dies. Sure, it's free runes, but at this point I think I'd prefer more collaboration. There are 3 crabs in this arena to bring to the fight, 2 in the church up the stairs, and 1 that you can spawn by going into a nearby corner. And speaking of these stairs, most of the time this boss will leave you alone if you dare to go up them. It's got a pretty tight leash for its little arena, and that's pretty easy to abuse. So, one by one, I bring these crabs into the fight, and they're gone. They do a little bit of damage, but not much more than I could have done if I was better at fighting the boss without getting hit. The crabs die pretty fast since the tree spirit attacks cover so much ground, and even worse, I didn't realize that I'd spawned the 3rd crab when I ran off to heal, causing it to die without really helping me out. I took another look around the church, and sure enough, no more crabs. Damn, the boss is only at like 70%, it's all on me now. So I keep rolling. 60%, the phase changes. 50%, I've been taking a lot of hits, but I'm trying to be patient. 40%, turns out patience isn't my strong suit here, and I've burned through a lot of flasks. I take another hit and run away to regroup. 30%, I'm doing well. I still have 5 flasks, but I take a couple of unexpected hits and get down to 50% of my own health. I know I'm fine. Nothing can deal that much damage to me, so my plan is to just keep fighting until I take another hit, and then immediately run off to heal. After all, I've got a life to lead and I can't fight this guy all day. But that is when tragedy strikes. This was so unexpected that my voice rose an octave in pure shock. I was so sure that this explosion could not deal more than 40% of my maximum health and damage, and yet here we are, dead from 50. What gives? It wasn't until reviewing the footage that I realized that I was right. The explosion itself only does about 40% damage. But in my panic, I tried to jump away at the last second for a burst of extra speed, and somehow ended up turning around as I jumped, which stopped my momentum completely. The The explosion caught me and sent me into a pillar of flame that spawned as an after effect of the explosion, taking the rest of my health in an instant. That sucks, dude. I was so sure that I had this in the bag. This was a very disjointed 23 minutes worth of an attempt just to end like this. It hurts. It's just like I remember. If nothing else, I at least now know that this is very possible. Painful and slow, perhaps, but I can't say that this isn't exactly what I signed up for when I started this run. I'm not out of ideas, though. Even though the crabs turn out to be almost completely useless to me as an ally, there's an even bigger potential ally just around the corner. Another ulcerated tree spirit. Both of these bosses have a pretty short leash, but as long as you keep making them angry, they tend to follow a bit further than they're supposed to. And with enough coaxing, I'm able to lure the second spirit down to where the first lives. And because of the terrain in this arena, once the second spirit is down there, it's pretty much stuck. The next step is to try to bait out attacks so these guys can beat the snot out of each other, all while trying to stay alive amongst the chaos and doing my best not to let the second spirit slink back to where it came from. That's a bit easier said than done.
No! How did you grab me? You're supposed to fight! You assholes!
The next attempt goes much better. I did have some initial issues getting this giant rotting tree to fit down this tiny little narrow staircase, but once I did, the chaos went into full swing and the tree spirits completely decimated each other with very little help required from me.
Yes!
And just for good measure, I decided to finish off the second tree spirit for absolutely no reason other than to see if I could, and because it was almost dead anyway. It still took another 4 minutes or so, but it was fun. In hindsight though, this could have ended very badly if the wrong tree spirit died first, and then I died before getting the kill on the correct one. I'm so glad that didn't happen, because then I'd really have to kill the boss on my own. And we can't have that now, can we? There's still a little bit of prep work to do before taking on any more bosses, so after struggling unreasonably hard making a jump that really shouldn't be any problem for me, I grab the Shadow Tree fragment in the center of this district, go unlock the Site of Grace next to the Demon Sunflower, head on down to the coast and Fisher to grab a few more fragments, stick my face in a giant hole, and make the run through Bellarat for one last fragment and unlock the Site of Grace next to the Dancing Lion. All this prep work puts me up to Shadow Blessing level 11, and for reasons I'll explain just a bit later, I decide that this is a good enough place to start. But there's one last thing to do before I can truly get things started. If you've been paying close attention, you might have noticed by now that I made such a big deal about killing the ulcerated tree spirit to grab a new tool, and then moved on without even mentioning it once. Well, that's mostly because I simply can't use it yet, but I'm about to go fix that. And to do that, we'll have to go back to school to pick up something we left behind. The spell we picked up is a sorcery called Mantle of Thorns. It requires 20 faith to cast, and since it's a sorcery, it needs a staff. It might seem kinda silly for a faith spell to require a staff, but this winds up being the best possible situation for this kind of spell for a reason I'll explain in a minute. First though, I need to respec. I don't have 20 faith, and despite dumping all my new levels into faith since the start of the DLC, knowing that this is coming up, I wasn't quite able to make it there. So I used this opportunity to shuffle my stats around. Previously, my mind was at 32 for exactly 10 casts of Bestial Vitality before I had to drink. But with the Blue Dew Talisman, I can bring this down. I'm not sure at this point if I can get away with leaving it at minimum, so I push it up to 24 just in case. I keep my vigor at 80, push the faith to 20, pump my dexterity to exactly 30, and dump the rest into endurance for more stamina and carry weight, with the hopeful goal of unlocking light roll after I gain a few more levels. And just for the extra defense power, I also pump a few points into arcane and strength, but I honestly don't think that defense power does much of anything at endgame, so that was probably a waste. After that's done, I take a journey across the rooftops of Raya Lucaria, and eventually find my way to the room that houses Azur's glintstone staff. This is the reason why it's good that Mantle of Thorns is a sorcery, because this staff gives 40 virtual dexterity for the purposes of increasing your casting speed. Seals don't have an equivalent to this, and with a super short duration of 30 seconds, I'll be casting this spell a lot. Casting speed caps at 70 dexterity, which is the reason for stopping myself at 30 when I did the respec. With as quick as the bosses are in the DLC, it feels important to have this capped as early as possible. Azur's staff has a requirement of 52 intelligence, but lucky for us, Miyazaki decided to let idiots like me use it regardless of the requirements at the cost of reducing the power of the sorcery scaling attribute, but guess what? Mantle of Thorns doesn't scale anyway. It's a static effect that cannot be powered up. But what is Mantle of Thorns, I hear you ask for possibly the 10th time because I still haven't explained it. Well, I'm glad you asked, because Mantle is a bizarre spell that was added for no other reason than to make my life easier. My life specifically, and before you go off about how egotistical of a statement that is, take a look at this. Mantle of Thorns is a spell that adds damage to your dodge roll, just like the Briar Armor does. In this little test, the Briar Armor does 33 damage by itself against this soldier. Mantle of Thorns on its own deals 42 damage to that same soldier. Immediately, you might think that all this investment and the constant need to cast a spell in the heat of combat wouldn't be worth an increase in damage that barely even amounts to double. But in a bizarre decision of questionable design choices, these two things actually synergize. You'd expect that Briar Armor plus Mantle would add the damage together to give us a total of 75 damage per roll. But something magical happens when you combine this spell with the Briar Armor. Rolling into this soldier with both effects deals 179 damage. A full set of Briar Armor seems to multiply the damage dealt by Mantle of Thorns by roughly 3.5. Altogether, Mantle of Thorns increases my roll damage by around 440%. What all this means is that, casting time aside, this spell will speed up Briar Armor boss fights by 4 to 5 times. A fight that would have taken 80 minutes will now take less than 20. This run just went from devastatingly horrific to downright manageable, and not much harder than my soldier's crossbow run, if I'm being honest. That's why I say that this spell was designed for me, for this run. There's no other reason to actually equip this spell. It doesn't last long enough, and it doesn't deal enough damage for you to want to bother wasting your time and your resources and your memorization slot on something that's so pathetic. But for this run, it's exactly what we need. And with all that in mind, let's finally take everything we've gathered into our first real boss fight of the run. Oh geez, these boss cards just keep getting more and more complicated, don't they? Well, look, because of the added complexity introduced by the short duration of the Mantle of Thorns spell, the required number of rolls to kill isn't quite as easily calculable as it would be without. Even at maximum casting speed, casting the spell represents an enormous risk. It's slow enough that I can only risk it for the absolute largest of openings that a boss has, so there will inevitably be some moments where Mantle isn't active and I'm having to dodge through a boss's onslaught, dealing some damage without Mantle as I do that. So the new RTK, or rolls to kill stat, represents the minimum amount of rolls that a boss will take to kill with Mantle activated. But I do try my best to keep it refreshed as much as I can. You might think it's a bit weird that I decided to go after the Golden Hippo before any other boss in this DLC, but there's a few reasons for that. First is that this boss is pretty chill as far as DLC bosses go. So many of them are extra aggressive, and I wanted to have the opportunity to get used to my new flow of casting Mantle of Thorns a million times in a fight against a boss that isn't personally insulted that I can take a breath without smelling it for 2 seconds. The second reason is that I actually like this boss. It's not very complicated, allowing me to focus more on my Mantle magic and less on figuring out what this thing wants to do. Before this DLC officially released and before I had the chance to play it, bigger content creators got the opportunity to dive in and make their own videos about what it has. I had a few commenters tell me about Mantle of Thorns, and my initial research led me to writing it off as a worthless gimmick. That was before I knew that the Blessed Blue Dew talisman existed, and before anyone realized that the damage is multiplied by the Briar Armor. This spell costs a mere 9 FP, 10 with Azur's staff because it increases the FP cost, and the duration is only 30 seconds. Even with such a low cost, 30 seconds is not a lot of time when your spellcasting resources are limited. Between Bestial Vitality and this spell, a person's FP would be drained well before the boss dies without the Blessed Blue. But with it, my FP is functionally infinite. If I cast Bestial Vitality every 120 seconds and Mantle of Thorns every 30, I'm spending an average of 29 FP per minute. There's no way that Mantle of Thorns wasn't designed specifically for this challenge. The math is too perfect. Of course, players aren't perfect, and there's very often extra downtime between casts that bring the average FP use per minute down, allowing more room to cast Mantle again before it wears off when you get an opening in more dangerous fights, and still not get close to running out of resources. And speaking of Mantle wearing off, it's difficult to hear, but I learned that there's a very distinct little sound that happens when it does wear off. A nice little sound cue that I was able to tune into over the course of the fight that let me know that I need to cast it again at my earliest convenience. I'm so glad that this sound effect exists, because other than the damage numbers at the bottom of the screen as I roll into the boss, it's actually sort of difficult to tell visually if the spell is still applied while I'm focusing on the boss's movements rather than my own. For the sake of these videos, I've been playing with the music turned off so I can use the game's sounds in the video much easier. And it turns out that this ends up being a mechanical benefit for me because it's so much easier to hear a light sound cue when it's not drowned out by the horns and strings of an epic orchestral soundscape. Sure, it may have been covered up by the conversations happening on the Chilluminati podcast that I was listening to as I was going through this run, but probably still much less often than the game's own soundtrack probably would. Anyway, I don't really have a lot to say about this boss. Sure, it killed me a couple of times, but it's all in the name of learning. I'm still getting used to this spell, and this hippo can be a little tricky sometimes. It doesn't have any attacks that gave me any particular stress over any of the other ones. It was just a dance between a man and his hippo, as God intended. Without too much effort, the hippo goes down. Time to beat, 12 minutes and 24 seconds. Honestly, the revelations that came from this fight are so much more interesting to me than the fight itself was. Despite the fact that I went real in depth on how much damage Mantle of Thorns actually does with the Briar armor, I still don't think that I was prepared for this. Not only did this boss not take me over an hour, it took less than 15 minutes. I mean, it's still a long time in the grand scheme of a Souls game boss fight, but compared to the hell that I went through with Moog and the entire base game boss roster, this ain't nothing. In fact, I think this might even be fun. I immediately head down the hidden path underneath the castle towards the dark light catacombs and get trolled really hard by a giant walking candle.
Oh my god!
It almost happened again, but this time I was barely fast enough and made it through safely, which means I can kill even more hippos. These have much less health, so they only took about 3¼ minutes each. Not bad. I then made my way down to the Darklight Catacombs, but forgot to record my journey traveling through it for the first time and attempting Jory at the end. Long story short, Jory sucks and is miserable to fight in most circumstances, but it's even worse here. I really thought I could make it through for the 3 fragments on the other side, but no. This is gonna have to wait. Once I abandoned that idea, I went back to Shadow Keep. I could have gathered a lot more fragments before ever fighting a boss, but I thought I remembered reading somewhere that if you enter the storehouse in Shadow Keep, then the invasion sign for Hornsent and Leda would go away. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but I wanted to be safe because I was not about to let Hornsent live for another run. So I found the invasion sign and helped Leda help me make her boss fight easier for later. A lesser Leda later is going to reduce my stress in this run by quite a lot.
Did I win or not?
And with that done, I'm free to make my way through the storehouse towards Mesmer, getting absolutely dumpstered on by a flame knight along the way. I make it through on the second try, but I'm not here to deal with Mesmer's mommy issues quite yet. So I grab the Grace and head back to the church district so I can run through the other side of the storehouse and down towards Gaius. But before fighting him, I head through the Marika-shaped hole in the wall so I can blow a finger. Next, I head to the ruins of Rao for more hippo slaughter and fragment finding, before finally heading back down to face the second boss of this run. Hey, fun fact, Commander Gaius only has 5 more health than the Golden Hippo does. But even though my blessing level is 3 higher than it was for the Hippo, I'm doing less damage to this big boar daddy than I was to the Hippo. In general, I feel like Gaius is a lot more dangerous than the Hippo is too, mostly because of that absolutely busted charge move. And hey, less fun fact, Gaius is apparently immune to damage while he's charging sometimes? I don't know, it feels really inconsistent and strange. Even with my pointy chainmail and rolling directly through the boss while it's charging at me, the boss doesn't take any damage. Sometimes. I think the only spot that has an active hurt box during this move is somewhere near the boar's tail, because that's usually where I noticed damage popping up, if it ever did. Sometimes from my roll and sometimes from his crazy move knocking me over and causing my flailing ragdoll of a body to fall into his. I'm not going to get into how absolutely awful the decision is to make this boss unable to be damaged during one of his most dangerous moves. I think it's really stupid, but at least for this run, and most runs honestly, it's not that big of a deal. Your priority during the charge move should just be dodging it. I just so happen to be in the unique position of my dodges doing decent damage, so it would have been nice to have the extra swag, but it's not really needed. This boss has quite a few moves that leaves a huge window for me to cast Mantle, so it's pretty easy to have a high uptime on the spell here. A perfect dodge on his boar charge is usually good enough, the boar's side swipe leaves more than enough time, and his big scary combo has enough leeway at the end of it to give me a window to stab myself in the foot with a staff. From there, it's just a matter of just trying not to get hit. And sometimes failing. Badly. There's really not much to say about Gaius for this run specifically, but I will say this. There's a lot of small aspects about this DLC's bosses that feel a bit rushed. A big part of it is the lack of build-up in cinema that most of them have compared to their contemporaries in the base game. Very few voice lines, very few introductory cinematics, and an overwhelming feeling that they're just kinda there. But runs like this and the crossbow run that I just did help highlight some of the more mechanical cracks to some of the boss's designs here, and I think that it comes down to a lack of player consideration when it comes to how some of these moves operate. Most likely not out of laziness like some people on Reddit might want you to believe, but probably more out of running out of time. And it's really small things too that have some of the biggest impact, and Gaius's charge move is one of them. On paper, this move is fine, I guess, but in implementation, it's an absolute disaster of an attack. The dodge window for this move is just unnecessarily tight, and even though it hasn't happened to me, there are instances where this attack can one-shot you if you're unlucky enough to get hit by it multiple times. I'm not completely against moves like this existing, moves that are extremely tight to dodge and can punish you hard for doing it wrong, but there needs to be more consideration for how the move feels to play against as a player. Obviously, getting hit never feels good, but getting hit by an attack that you fail to dodge 50% of the time or more feels worse, partially because it can feel unfair even if it technically isn't. But something that can help mitigate how bad it feels is having the attack come out more rarely or with a cooldown in between each use of it. The boar charge is one of those moves that absolutely feels bad to play against most of the time, and probably needs to have extra limitations placed on its usage. Something like a cooldown of at least 15 to 30 seconds, or a minimum range for its use, would go a long way in making the attack feel better to engage with. It could definitely be worse, but it's really not fun to get hit by the tail end of a hitbox that you feel like you avoided properly. And it's doubly not fun to have that same attack happen twice in a row at a range that is extremely difficult to properly react to. I won't say that this issue is exclusive to the DLC either, because Malenia's waterfowl is a thing that I'm still shocked that there is no cooldown for, as evidenced by my crossbow run a couple of years ago. But there does seem to be at least a few more instances of this in the DLC, at least at the current patch level, than there is in the base game. What makes these instances so interesting is that attacks like these just kind of drag down the experience of an otherwise fun boss. Malenia is fun, but the threat of waterfowl back-to-back is an absolute nightmare. I find Gaius really fun to fight, but the charge move feels overtuned in a way that makes me stress out about it for the entire fight. One move can drag the entire experience down in a big way, and you can bet that I'll be calling those out throughout this run. Despite my critiques and the implication that I had a lot of trouble, Gaius was dead in only about 40 minutes worth of attempts. It took me a little bit to get used to his attack patterns again, but once I locked in, it was as good as done. Time to beat, 12 minutes and 19 seconds. Apparently 5 more health than the hippo and 5 less seconds to beat. Neat. The main reason I went after Gaius so early is because he guards 5 sweet fragments behind his boss arena. So I grab those, head back to the shaman village to grab some lady's hair that I forgot to grab earlier, and then head back to the gravesite plains to make some mistakes. There's only one method that I know of that's able to get you down to both Karo's hidden grave and the base of Jagged Peak, and it's south of Castle Ensis through this old man's home. Look, old man, no matter how loud you yell at me to get off your lawn and how much you say I'm not allowed in your home, I'm coming through here whether you like it or not. And, oh, he's dead. Whoops. Well, now that that's happened, I guess I can make my way over to Karo's hidden grave and make sure that the hippos have no more means of reproduction before heading up through the dragon's den of Jagged Peak to find myself in front of the arena of a big angry dragon. I'm up to Shadow Tree Blessing level 17 now and feeling pretty invigorated by my recent successes, so I decide that this is probably a good time to give Bale a try. Bale is a very interesting boss to fight with this playstyle. He can be difficult to attack under normal circumstances with a normal weapon because of the way his head moves and how desperately he wants you to get away from his face, but when your only means of attack involves throwing your soft, fleshy body into the boss's hard, scaly head, it can feel impossible to actually deal damage. There's a lot going against the player in this fight that has to be solved, and it takes me quite a while to figure everything out, so a lot of this footage is going to look pretty amateur. So please bear with the clown on screen while he takes his lumps. The first big problem is that this dragon, and I guess this applies to every dragon in the game, tends to move his head like he's a wacky waving inflatable. And to be super fair to Big Bale here, he's probably the most calm dragon in that aspect. He's not exactly still, but he does take me a while to figure out the patterns of how his wobbly head moves with each attack so I can direct my attacks properly. I could roll into his body or his stumpy little left leg, but his body takes a lot less damage than his head does, and when I'm underneath him, I can't really react properly to what he's doing. Plus, it's just not safe in the instance where Bale decides to bathe the ground in fire, which he does fairly often if you're up in his business. Fortunately, it does seem that attacking through his swings does full damage, so at least the act of avoiding damage does pretty good damage in and of itself. The second problem is the camera. This wasn't as much of an issue for my other playthroughs, since I could keep a healthier distance from the dragon's face due to, well, normal weapons having a little bit of reach. But when you're rolling around the same protruding spot of the boss that the camera's lock-on point lives, the camera tends to get extremely chaotic. And a chaotic camera means that I screw up my timings and positioning far more often than is healthy. This gets me killed quite a lot. It's hard to know what direction you're about to roll in when you don't know what the camera is trying to do. I do eventually discover the power of playing without lock-on, but it takes an embarrassingly long time to figure it out. And the unfortunate part is that shifting to playing without lock-on, despite helping overall, created a couple of new issues. One of them is in recognizing his flying fireball attack in time to lock on, otherwise I probably just die. And another issue is linked with the next problem. And that next problem is how completely jank fire is in this game. I went over it in my last run, but this effect is broken in the most frustrating ways. And much to my absolute dismay, I was able to catch yet another instance of Bale's fire breath being naughty on camera. I personally think that this is another instance of the boss's polish being just slightly off, because there's quite a bit that can go wrong with Bale's fire in a bunch of surprising and awful ways. This is obviously one of them, but what about when Bale opens the fight with a fire breath as soon as you cross the fog wall and ends up clipping you despite running to the side like you're supposed to? I'll be honest, every time that happened, I started the fight pre-tilted because of it. It's so annoying and in my opinion should never happen in a properly polished boss fight. There's also the weird occasions where Bale's fire breath will cut you off as you're running from where you think it should be, completely unexpectedly. To be fair, you probably could predict this one by looking closer at his head as he's about to shoot his fire, but this is such a weird case that feels more like an accident in the boss's behaviors than a genuine property of the move. There's even more little inconsistencies with Bale's various fire breath moves, such as this one, where if you right his head as he sweeps, he'll still hurt you at the end of the attack. Or this one, where he inexplicably chooses to use his long-range flame breath in an instance where I think he's going to go for the ground flame breath since I'm practically underneath him already. Since I started running away to avoid the ground fire, I got completely blasted by this attack, and it just felt kinda cheap in the moment. Maybe that one's completely intended, I don't know. It just felt kinda whack, you know? And there's one more fire attack that Bale likes to link into his attack combos in Phase 2, specifically after his lightning stabs. Sometimes he'll flip behind you and blast some fire your way. Without lock-on, this can be extremely disorienting and was a big problem for me, at least at first. In spite of the laundry list of things to figure out, it's all completely solvable except for the fire breath opening at the fog wall. As jank as the fire tends to be, I eventually figured out that it's far more consistent the closer you are to the boss itself. Beyond that, it's just a matter of really drilling this fight into my muscle memory. There's so much more to keep track of with Bale on this run than there was in any of my other runs so far, and I was forced into really figuring this boss out on a more intimate level. Even though there's not a huge difference between Blessing level 17 and 20, I think coming in here so early was hubris on my part. There's so much complexity in fighting Bale with this style that I didn't expect, and even though I don't think it's insurmountable right now, my brain just isn't falling into the correct places. It's not even the fact that I have to find openings for casting spells because Bale gives more than enough opportunities for that to be a non-issue. It's literally just a get good problem at this point, and over around 2 hours worth of attempts, my best attempt was 14.5 minutes to get Bale to only 60%. I'm never able to get Bale's Phase 1 down super comfortably around this time, and pretty much every attempt at Phase 2 ended so fast that it might as well have not even happened. So, with my tail tucked tightly between my legs, I decided to shelve Bale for the moment and head on over to some bosses that I have a bit more confidence with.
Those stripped of the grace of gold shall all meet death in the embrace of Mesmer's flame.
You know, I like Bale decently well, but his fire attacks are some of the most offensive in the entire game. Mesmer, on the other hand, is some of FromSoft's finest work. Mesmer is always a fun fight, and the more that I learn about him, the more fun he is to me. In contrast to the other bosses I've fought up to this point though, the main problem, aside from remembering his attack patterns, was finding proper opportunities to cast my spells. I know his biggest openings will work pretty well thanks to my crossbow run, but those biggest openings are rare enough that I try pretty recklessly to fit in a cast where I probably shouldn't in between attacks that I know might get me punished. And they do, but only sometimes. The safety of a lot of these openings depends heavily on what Mesmer chooses to follow up with, and it seems to be more rare for him to punish me than to let me get away with it, so I ended up taking these risks for a big portion of this fight. What really allowed that though is the fact that I'm just a little bit overblessed for this fight at this point. Turns out that rolling all over the continent to grab leftover Scooby snacks does a lot for your survivability, but I'm not complaining. It made this fight feel a lot more relaxing, I guess, than it otherwise might have been. It's not too long before I push Mesmer into a second phase, and in my opinion, Phase 2 is way easier than Phase 1. Mesmer's first phase feels so much more aggressive and unhinged, where his second phase feels so much more calculated and deliberate, like a snake. In other words, slower. Not very like a snake. Kind of odd. What's kind of weird too is that his snake attacks don't really deliver on the power that their visuals kind of imply that they should have. And to make things even more strange, you deal increased damage to his snake body after it fails an attack and lies helplessly on the ground for a brief moment before Mesmer pops out of it once again. It's not a whole lot of extra damage, around 10% from the looks of it, but still you might expect that this enormous scaled beast of a demigod might take less damage when caught a bit flat-footed. I mean, it's a big snake with a big scaly body. Maybe it should have more armor. I'm just saying. And with the attacks being so large and slow, they're generally pretty easy to dodge. As much as I love this fight, Mesmer's Phase 2 feels underdeveloped in the opposite way that some other bosses in this game do. Like, his second phase is a step backwards in his power. I don't know, maybe Vadi can extrapolate some sick lore reasons why this seems to be the case. Like maybe Marika was empowering her son by sealing the serpent instead of caging his powers. Because as intimidating as he looks here, I think Phase 1 for the whole fight would have been a bit more difficult. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though, because there is definitely one big snake attack that always kinda makes me poop my pants a little bit. And it's this big one where he explodes into a pile of striking serpents and ends with one of his signature moves. The signature moves are deadly but easy to avoid. It's this barrage of strikes that comes just before that can be tricky to dodge, with the overwhelming amount of snakes trying to take a piece of your flesh. It can be outranged decently well if you start far enough away, but if you're in his face when he begins the attack, the shockwave can deal some damage and cause you to scramble to safety, and may even force you into a panicked state, which will make you take even more damage. One more thing to note about Phase 2 is his coiled strike. I don't know what else to call it. It's a very snake-like maneuver that he does at the end of a lot of his combos now, and while it is unsettling, this is a huge reason for him feeling so much slower. It takes forever for it to come out, and the hitbox seems mercifully small. There's also a pretty huge end lag on his part, enough that I can consistently fit a Mantle cast in before he has a chance to realize that he's made a terrible mistake. And if I don't need to cast, I can just follow through with his trajectory to be extra aggressive and stack on the damage while he contemplates his hatred for his own mother. Something funny that happened to me at the end of this fight though, it looked like he was about to use one of his big scary snake attacks in the moment that I killed him, which caused a bit of a scare as the fight ended.
Oh my god, that might have actually... What? What's happening? No! Oh. Don't scare me like that.
Time to beat 12 minutes and 33 seconds. That was only the second attempt too, definitely needed after the Bale struggle. Normally, this is when I'd finally make my way through the ruins of Ra, but since I've already trudged my way through it for its fragments, we can move straight on to the next boss. In some ways, I was pretty worried about Romina. My crossbow run taught me that she could be unexpectedly difficult, but that experience did teach me a lot about how to fight her. My biggest worry though was that because of her unusual shape, that she'd have an unforgiving hurt box. Something awful like Renala or Godfrey, but somehow even worse. To my surprise though, Romina is easier to roll on than a speed stick and smells twice as good. Why do I write some of these things? The only really awkward thing, aside from that joke, was that for some reason, the sound of dealing damage to her isn't as loud as it tends to be with other bosses. Usually there's a very distinct sound effect that comes with the hit, but with Romina, it's barely audible at all. This did lead me to believe that there were hurtbox issues at first, but luckily it's just awkward sound mixing. Romina proved to be not a lot of trouble. The main reason was that for some reason, the first few attempts against her felt like I was playing in slow motion. Especially coming hot off the heels of Mama's boy Mesmer, who moves extremely quickly in comparison. I'll be real though, I don't remember a lot about this fight. I'm just kind of going through the motions this time, reacting and casting as necessary while listening to the Chilluminati podcast in the background. Romina was down on only the third attempt. Time to beat, 11 minutes and 38 seconds. Easy. Romina's death means that we can indulge in our tree-burning habit once again and get delivered to the spiraling city of Anirlim. I make my way through and collect all the fragments along the way, and once I reach the end and level my blessings up again, I realized that I missed a fragment somewhere. Turns out I forgot about this super easy to find one on the way to Shadow Keep somehow, and that gets me to Shadow Blessing level 19, which is the highest you can possibly reach before fighting the worst non-NPC boss in the entire DLC. Despite coming here with the highest blessing level I can, the fight with Jory still manages to be absolutely miserable. With any melee weapon, your damage is pretty good, and you can pretty easily score a backstab on this prick. With a crossbow, a lot of the issues caused by his spell spam and teleportation and his army of summons are mostly alleviated by the power of having a ranged attack with no cast time. But with low damage that's almost completely dependent on being able to cast a spell that lasts a mere 30 seconds against all of this, and the fact that I have to be in his face, it's a nightmare, dude. Where most fights in this run are of the get good variety on my part, this one feels so far away from that. Don't get me wrong, there are absolutely ways to mitigate the pain that you can take and some tricks that you can employ during this fight, but this fight never becomes comfortable. And to make things even worse, this fight might start pretty low energy and docile, But as Jory takes more and more damage, the amount of trash that he summons to overwhelm both your senses and your patience increases to frustrating levels, to the point where even some of his melee attacks towards the end of the fight will summon a parade of dudes who are more than happy to grant you a golden shower that you never asked for. But as much as these guys suck to deal with over the course of the fight, there's at least a small mercy in the fact that most of the little dudes will disappear after they use a single attack, making it so that you really just have to focus on avoiding them. And as lousy as this arena can be for escaping a dangerous situation, it can be even more useful as a shield against the unreasonable stream of golden arcs that are thrown your way at all times. Seriously, if these gravestones didn't block these projectiles, I don't know if I could have beaten this boss. The one exception to the disappearing summons is this Timu version of the Godskin Noble. Jory will ring his stupid little bell, and like the moon from Majora's Mask, this dude will descend on you with all the grace of a toddler gently petting an animal. He's not done though. If he was a normal summon, he'd politely leave like everyone else, but this one just doesn't get the hint and he'll follow you around until you promise to smell his breath. And because I know that description was a bit of a stretch, that was a euphemism for the fire breath attack that he'll use the moment he gets close enough to you, which will most likely be when you're desperately trying to roll into Jory himself before he teleports to the other side of the arena once again to reset the situation and make you wonder what turn in your life landed you in this freaking moment in time. Fortunately, there's a lot of little beneficial things going on in this fight that make it more possible to win than it would otherwise be. The arena being your shield is one of them. The other is just how slowly the fight starts. You can get quite a lot done before the fight becomes overwhelming, but to balance it out, the second half of the fight can feel impossible as this guy teleports away and then starts to spam. Most importantly though, Jory has this one move that forces him to stand still and do nothing for a significant amount of time. This move unfortunately forces you to move as well, so if you don't have a mantle on, you don't have any opportunity to cast it until Jory's done with his turn, meaning you've likely wasted your best opportunity to sneak in some damage. This move is a godsend though, because if you do have Mantle on, you can roll at a good rhythm to chip away at Jory's health, and if you're lucky, he'll continue dancing with you by attacking instead of teleporting away immediately. The length of time that this move takes for Jory to cast it means that most of his lackeys, except for the big fire breath boy, will have time to disappear while you move in. This move felt annoying at first, but eventually it became the safest opening for me to exploit. Ultimately, the secret to this fight is to be patient. Only move in after a round of summons has disappeared, and don't be afraid to spend some time hiding instead of fighting. Eventually, a chance will present itself, and you can chip away. This fight was most often lost to being too impatient and trying to move in while a stream of death was being sent at me. So once I embraced the slowness, the fight became a lot more approachable. Fun? Absolutely not. Easy? No. This fight sucks. At least his health and his defense is relatively low. Time to beat 13 minutes and 3 seconds. It doesn't seem that long, but considering how low Jory's rolls to kill stat is compared to the rest of the bosses I've fought so far, the fact that he currently holds the record as the longest fight that I've finished really goes to show how annoying he can be. With Jory dead though, we can finally claim the final 3 fragments in the DLC and cap our blessing at level 20. And with the upcoming bosses, we're gonna need all the help we can get. Now that I'm capped out on Shadow Tree blessings, the world is my oyster. I can go wherever I want, fight whomever I please, and rage to my heart's content. But since we're here, we might as well go and fight the best boss in the entire game. I mean, why not, right? But first I gotta stop. Sit still. Jeez.
I ask you forgive me, dearest Nanaya.
Midra is such a fun boss. The slow and deliberate attacks carry a weight and gravitas that is unmatched by any of the bosses in this DLC. In fact, I think that this style is what makes me enjoy Moog so much. Despite the speed and power of his attacks, as long as I'm not getting comboed into oblivion, I can catch strays and be perfectly fine for the first phase of this fight. I found that it's much safer for me to stay either right up in his stank or on the other side of the arena. Anywhere in between seems to be the danger zone. That's fine by me though, his stank is where I want to be if I want to deal damage. Midra has quite a few openings where I can... hold on, just gotta kill this guy again. Would you... Dude, stop! Jeez, finally. As I was saying, Midra has quite a few openings where I can safely cast Mantle. It's not exactly free like it is in a lot of other fights, and is pretty tight in some of these openings, and some of the bigger openings are somewhat rare, but there are a lot of timings that I can exploit if I really need to. Rolling behind his whirlwind, avoiding his ground stab, sidestepping his slow thrusts. These are all wide open for me to refresh my mantle if necessary, and that's very appreciated. It does take a few attempts for me to calibrate against this dude's weirdly slow swings and... Dang it. Okay, as much as I love this fight, I could do without having to shove this Twiggy man's face into the hardwood of this room on every single attempt. It's not a big deal with any weapon that deals more damage than a tickle against a sunburn, but in these runs it's a brutal time waster. Like, having to kill this Twiggy man on each attempt is the main reason why a death against Midra is so frustrating. This pre-fight is around 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes of my time, depending on how much damage the Twiggy man ends up doing to me, and how patient I want to be against his attacks and in regenerating my health. It's not a lot of time, but it does tend to add up with each failure. Like, it'd be nice if Midra's boss form had stayed spawned behind the fog wall after the Twiggy man dies once. Just a little quality of life thing, you know, but you really feel it on runs like this. Anyway, back to Midra proper. It doesn't take too long for me to finish calibrating against Midra, and I'm back at home with his attack patterns. Phase 2 is where the real fight begins though, and there's 2 big attacks that feel like they're in that realm of unpolished that I've been harping on for this video. The first is his straight frenzy shot. This attack hits brutally hard, stacks up a lot of madness, and comes out fast. Typically, the best solution for this kind of attack is to run perpendicularly to the boss and the shots should miss you. But there's something weird with this attack because sometimes, despite your movement, you will get clipped and it won't feel like your fault. This move hits way too hard and is far too punishing for it to feel inconsistent like this. And the amount of madness buildup that it confers is enormous, almost guaranteeing that you'll be hit by the status effect if it so much as grazes the hair on the back of your ass cheeks. And this attack is even a little bit bugged. To be fair, I don't think this is unique to Midra, because I think this bug has been around in some form or another for a long time. But if the projectile hits you while you're rolling, you won't take damage because you are in invulnerability frames, but the status buildup will still apply to you. I found one instance where the status effect hit me while the attack didn't, but it's really scary knowing that something that didn't hit you could cause you to take damage and probably die. This shouldn't happen, period. Now, there is a way to avoid this attack pretty consistently. All you have to do is stay close to Midra, and when you see him charging this up, just get in his face. He's simply too tall, and he'll shoot over you instead of at you. It's kinda silly. Don't get me wrong, I do love that this is a valid strategy for avoiding this attack, but it really shouldn't be the only consistent way to do so. Part of what makes Souls games so great is that there's a million different ways to do things, and I think that this DLC goes too far in the way of prescriptive solutions for some boss moves. Radahn's Cross Slash, Midra's Frenzy Shot, Meter's Death Laser, I'd even say that Malenia's Waterfowl falls in this same bucket. Moves that have such a specific way to avoid them that it feels like the game is actively taking your freedom of gameplay expression away from you, and punishing you for not knowing the 2 or 3 hyper-specific solutions to avoid a brutally strong attack. I understand that taking away your freedom sounds dramatic, especially in the political climate of 2024, but that really is what it feels like, albeit on a much less existential level. I feel like there should be no reason why running directly left or right to this attack should sometimes clip me, especially if getting clipped can force you to take more of those hits, which, added up, hit like an absolute truck. The other big attack that kept causing me some big scary problems is a 2-swing combo where both swipes send a blast of frenzied flame forward past Midra's sword. The first is pretty simple to avoid having such an enormous windup, but the second one for some reason just kept absolutely demolishing me. I was probably dodging a hair too early in fear of getting blasted, but in my defense, when this happens...
What was that? What? The damage! Oh my god! Fuck.
I think the fear is somewhat justified. That's just me though. Take another look at how my health plummets in this instance. I'm sitting at a solid 3/4 of my maximum health at 80 vigor, and this move essentially one-shots me. This specific death happened to me twice, and I think in these specific instances I hadn't quite learned to expect the second move to come out so quickly. But I also don't think that this move should be capable of dealing this much damage, and before you say it's because of the madness proc, that only happened on one of these deaths. On the other one, it was just raw damage. My madness status wasn't even that high. Looking more closely at the attack, it didn't exactly one-shot me from 75% health. It actually hit me 4 times over about 16 frames. 16 frames can be a lot in terms of reaction time, but I was probably locked into hit stun from the very first hit with no means of escaping once this wombo combo started. Again, this shouldn't happen. Period. While the damage these two attacks are capable of dealing is completely unreasonable in my mind, at the very least they're completely avoidable. If I remember the speed of the second swing of this attack, I can usually avoid damage, or at least instant death. And by moving in on Midra as he prepares the... you can pretty reliably not get hit. I don't think that excuses the inconsistency or the power, but at least I can work around them. They do increase my general anxiety around the fight though, and that anxiety can make me sloppy, and that sloppiness can lead to death. I also died a lot to his big frenzy combo in phase 2, but I think I've analyzed this boss enough for now. Long story short, this attack was the cause of a decent number of my deaths, but that was usually because I got hit once and then panicked myself to death. It's a scary attack, but really just a matter of dodging at the correct times. I was eventually able to figure Midra out and survive long enough to bring him down. As much trouble as I had with a few of his attacks, he still only took around an hour and 40 minutes worth of attempts, which isn't so bad in the grand scheme of things. Time to beat, 15 minutes and 5 seconds. Longest fight so far. That fight happened over the course of 2 days, and at the end of the first day, it was pretty late, and I was feeling pretty stonewalled. But I've been forgetting some other bosses for a very specific reason, and I thought that this would be the perfect time to get my spirits back up with a quick win.
Cleanse away this strumpet's fire.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that this fight isn't fair. No, not because this boss is hard, but because I don't think FromSoft intended the Divine Beast Dancing Lion to be fought with a maxed out blessing level. Despite my elevated stats, I do find it interesting that this guy's defenses are so high. Sure, his health is pathetic, but at only 125 damage per roll, he's got some defenses that puts Midra to shame. I'm horrible at fighting this boss though. I hadn't learned how to fight him properly before this run, and after this run, I'm confident in saying that I still don't exactly know how to dodge all of its elemental shenanigans. As a result, this fight was extremely sloppy. I was tired and about ready to go to bed for the day, but the power of my blessings just kinda carried me all the way through to victory, and every shot felt like a tickle compared to the might of Baal and Midra. As a result, the Divine Beast went down on the first try in the most embarrassing display of victory that I've put to film. I have nothing else to say. Time to beat, 10 minutes and 47 seconds. Midra, my favorite boss, is dead, so now it's time to head to the boss that I feel the most neutral about in this entire DLC. The Shadow Tree avatar is a bit of an awkward fight. As much as I made fun of the dragons earlier in this video for having goofy necks, this guy puts them all to shame. This boss is the wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man of this game, and it's a weird fight. Luckily, the avatar likes to keep its head near the ground for easy access, and I want to try to roll into that head as much as possible instead of the body, since the damage difference is pretty extreme. 42 versus 141. Yeah, I think the choice is clear. I do end up hitting the limbs a lot though, just as a natural side effect of dodging through the boss's flailing swings. And that head moves a lot. And there's a lot of attacks that kind of force me out of the prime pummeling position as I maneuver through this fight. This boss has 3 phases, and while the defenses don't change from phase to phase, the boss's attacks and patterns do. And so does its health. Apparently, taking the crit after defeating one makes the next one's health come in 30% lower, but I don't consider a crit to be within the rules of this run, even barehanded, so unfortunately that's an extra 8,000 or so health that I've got to roll through the old-fashioned way. I kind of go back and forth on whether or not I actually like this fight. On one hand, it's pretty unique. 3 lives, escalating attack patterns through each life, and it's a dried-up demon sunflower. That's cool as hell, dude. But it also runs away a lot, especially starting in Phase 2, has some awkward projectiles, and a bunch of thorny vine attacks that feel like they have weirdly ambiguous dodge timings due to how strange the attack's animations are. I think I like this fight more with normal weapons than I do with these weird challenge runs. Similar to Bale, the sunflower's head makes it awkward to roll into, and the fact that I have to basically be inside this boss to deal damage to it makes it that much more difficult to stay safe over the course of the fight. For the most part, this fight came down to figuring out how to keep those safety numbers as high as possible and to try not to take damage, which wound up being pretty difficult for me. I'm not great at fighting this boss, but after a few attempts I was able to get enough of it figured out to push through with no flasks remaining at the end, and pushed to the absolute edge of my health. Just a weird little boss that gave me no strong feelings one way or another, especially in this run. Time to beat, 17 minutes and 12 seconds. Even longer than Midra, but it kinda cheats with how much it runs away. So, I've been putting this off for long enough. I've sunk some time into him and learned some things, but now that I'm at the maximum blessing level, there's not really anything else that I can do to make this any easier on myself. So let's give Bale another try, shall we? Despite coming in with 3 more blessing levels than what I had before, I'm only dealing 5 extra damage per roll. Not exactly the difference maker that I was hoping for. At least the damage I take is downgraded from apocalyptic to simply catastrophic, so there's that, I guess. Really, it's just a matter of drilling this fight until the fight gets done at this point, and getting more comfortable with avoiding some of the attacks that have been giving me trouble. I start these attempts without lock-on this time, and I come in with the intent to keep an eye out for moments where I need to quickly lock on again to better avoid damage. That's one of the biggest things that I have to learn at this point, but unfortunately most of the real danger lies in Phase 2, where things just never seem to stop exploding. That doesn't mean that Phase 1 is easy, but compared to Phase 2, it's a walk in the park. It's just a matter of reaching it with as many resources as possible, and then hoping I don't blow it when it's time to really perform, which I do. Twice. Both of the first attempts ended with Bale's strafing laser explosion attack. This attack looks so cool, but it's so hard to properly avoid it. The combination of the camera and the sheer scale of this attack is what makes it so hard to avoid. The first wave of fire is tough to see coming if you stay locked onto Bale during it, but the camera just doesn't really give you a good angle to know exactly when to dodge. And once you do dodge it, you immediately have to start reacting to the next attacks, which come from a different direction. And you probably do want to lock onto Bale for this part. The laser he sweeps over your face isn't hard to avoid, but the explosion afterwards has such a tight dodge timing that it can feel a bit unfair. Apparently, the best way to avoid this is to start sprinting sideways away from the laser area as soon as you dodge the first attack, which will put you further away from the center of a large explosion hitbox, which makes it much easier to avoid, possibly missing you altogether if you're lucky. I really like the spectacle of this attack. I just wish it was easier to read, and that the finishing explosion wasn't so crazy tight to avoid. That attack became the main stressor for this fight in this run. I was able to figure out how to properly avoid the fireball transition by just running perfectly to the right. I was able to adjust to the lightning stab flip around fire breath combo by being ready to lock on the instant where I know Bale might decide to bounce away. I was even able to make the jank fire effects mostly a non-issue at this point, but I just couldn't nail down the timing and method for dodging the strafe. It wasn't until deep into the third attempt where I felt like I was starting to figure it out, but not exactly with any level of consistency. I was so personally defeated by this attack that the few times I did manage to properly dodge it, it just felt like the game broke in my favor. But after a long and grueling fight, with the anxiety overflowing and causing me to slip up against moves that I thought I had long since figured out, Bale finally goes down. This was an absolutely brutal fight where it felt like things could go horribly wrong at any moment, and they often did. But not this time, Bale. It may have come down to the wire, but not this time. Time to beat 31 minutes and 9 seconds. Now imagine that without Mantle of Thorns. Yikes. Bale was a slog, a brutal, painful slog with complex attack patterns and the power of a Saiyan on steroids. But now that he's become a permanent resident of the fine crevices in my spiky armor, it's time to move on. I don't have a lot of logic for the order in which I'm tackling bosses. I just wanted to do something a bit different than I normally have, especially since this DLC allows you so much freedom. I also knew that some of the later game bosses were going to be absolutely brutal, so I wanted to try to balance the challenge with the chill. So with that in mind, we're heading through the fissure to face the next boss. You know, I think that the Putrescent Knight has the lowest health out of all the Remembrance bosses in the DLC. I guess it makes sense with the way that this budget orphan of Kos likes to scamper around the arena instead of fighting directly, but I do kinda wish that he had a bit more health to make the fight last just a bit longer. Even though this guy likes to run around instead of attacking, I found it more challenging than expected to find a safe opening to don my mantle. I guess I was afraid of him throwing that big old weapon at my face after I begin casting since I feel safe because of the distance, but that didn't seem to happen in the way that I was expecting. I was probably just being overly safe. Still, there did seem to be a surprisingly long period of time in between safe casting windows, but once I got the mantle on, the damage began stacking up quickly. The Putrescent Knight was down on the first attempt, easy as pie. Time to beat 8 minutes and 52 seconds. After taking a few minutes to make the local simp jealous that his girl likes me more than him, I set my sights on the freaky fingy queen herself. Today, I learned that Meter has more health than Bale. I guess not even a massive dragon can stack up against the eldritch abomination hiding in this terrible basement. Another thing I learned today is how absolutely miserable this boss can be to fight when your tools aren't quite up to the task. Meter took me nearly 3 hours worth of attempts. Bale took a similar amount of time, but at least with Bale, I knew that victory was just a matter of time. Each attempt, no matter how heartbreaking it ended up feeling, felt like I was learning more and more with each death. I always saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Same with Midra. Meter, on the other hand, may have become one of my least favorite bosses of all time over the course of this run. This attack sucks, this attack sucks, this attack sucks, and these stupid little baby hands are absolutely awful to have to juggle with the rest of what this boss can throw at me. The main reason this attack sucks is the same reason it sucks on the other finger enemies in this game. It just feels weirdly impossible to dodge if you don't start far enough away from it when the attack begins. And since the boss can move faster than you while it's happening, then you're liable to get clipped. You can make sure that she uses it less by staying away from her side, but you will end up on her side at some point over the course of this long, drawn-out fight. This attack sucks because it's absolutely and completely undodgeable without certain Ashes of War. I went over it at length in my previous video, but this thing sucks and kinda puts me on a timer. Pretty much every time Meter uses this attack, that's a flask gone. And to make it even worse, I'm stuck pretty close to Meter for a lot of this fight. And there were times when the opening explosion to this attack forced me into an instant death laser. I hate it. I hate it so much. And this attack sucks because it has such a weird timing. Out of all my complaints with Meter, this is definitely the most get good of them all, but man, it's so hard to find a consistent dodge timing for this, with as ambiguous as she looks as she's spinning up in the sky like a frickin' Beyblade. After a couple of hours, I finally figured out that if I stay underneath her and dodge immediately as she reaches 2 full rotations in the sky, chances are pretty good that I'll get a perfect dodge out of it. All attempts to avoid this move by building distance and then dodging through her were a failure. And of course, the little baby hands suck because I have to deal with the boss's barrage of crap while these little guys roam around trying to finger me to death. It doesn't take a lot of rolls to kill them, but it takes enough that their presence can be an enormous distraction. To make matters worse, their hurt boxes aren't properly done, causing me to impotently slide off them for a significant chunk of my rolls. The damage they do, while not enormous, can add up to be problematic. But the main issue with them is that they can stagger me while I'm trying to time dodges against Meter herself. Far too many times they'll tickle me just enough at just the wrong time to cause me to get absolutely bodied by this boss. It's not even too uncommon for me to be so distracted by the combination of the babies and the boss that a second litter pops out before I even have the chance to deal with the first. There are 2 small things that work in my favor here though. The first is that her baby summons seem to have a minimum range. As long as I stayed as close to Meter as possible, it seemed like she'll just never choose to summon the babies. This is easier said than done because she does have some moves that are just made to build some distance between us. But once I learned this little quirk, the boss became a bit more manageable for me. And second, her bulbous finger mass at the front of her body is a significant weak point, causing about 50% extra damage if I roll into it. It looks like it should be easy to hit this for most attacks, but the specific location that you have to hit for the increased damage is more finicky than it looks. Plenty of rolls look like they should have been a weak point hit, but did normal damage anyway. It's nice that it exists at all because it helps make this otherwise super annoying boss go by that much more quickly. Meter has a bunch of awful attacks, sure, but I think the most egregious thing about this boss, aside from the, completely undodgeable death laser, is the size of the arena. I brushed on this in the previous run, but man, when you're rolling around at the speed of snail, it's so much easier to bump into the edge of this arena than it really should be. I actually don't think that the arena is any smaller than Bale's. I ran all the way around it and roughly plotted it on the map, and it seems to be pretty large. The main problem seems to be that Meter absolutely does not respect the boundaries of the arena. I think Bale has some issues for sure, but the arena and the way the boss uses it absolutely is not one of them. I don't think there's very many bosses in From's catalog that do this, but the way Bale respects the arena that he's placed in is absolutely brilliant. Despite spending many hours on him over the course of several runs, I don't think that the arena's walls were ever a problem. The first and most obvious reason is that, hey, you can see the walls. They're there, and they're tangible, and you can see them, and because of that, you can plan to avoid them and focus your positioning in a way that you don't get backed into a corner. Second, Bale will actively bounce himself away from the arena's edge if he gets too close. An absolutely honorable Chad move if I've ever seen one. And third, some of Bale's attacks reset his position in the arena in pretty ingenious ways. Meter, on the other hand, has none of those quirks. In fact, she'll happily slide into a wall if it means that it's gonna ruin your night. Nothing makes a stressful boss more stressful like having it use its ultimate move when you realize you've bumped into the edge of the arena recently. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I don't know why From insists on having arenas constructed like this. It's a cool visual, sure, but unless the boss is gonna respect the bounds of the arena in a way that makes them almost impossible to bump into because of the boss's movement, then give me some damn walls. Renala, the Elden Beast, and now Meter all have this arena type, and Renala is the only one where it's almost never a problem. And that's mostly because she moves slowly and she kind of moves in circular motions. Please stop doing this or design the bosses to care. As a side note, on this same subject, Rom the Vacuous Spider from Bloodborne uses this same arena type. I've never bothered to check if there are edges to the boss's arena, but it doesn't really matter because the boss barely even moves, and because of that, it's fine. Anyway, I hate this boss more and more with each run. Bale might have been a slog, but at least it felt like I was learning. Meter, on the other hand, felt like I was just trying to find workarounds for her more broken or frustrating aspects, and that I was at the mercy of RNGesus to give me good patterns. But eventually, I finally got her down. Here's my advice to anybody watching this video: never attempt this fight with this spell and this playstyle. It's not worth it. Time to beat 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Despite her massive health pull and all the crap I have to deal with, damage uptime is pretty high, the weak spot's there, and there are plenty of openings to cast Mantle. And ultimately I did feel like I got pretty dang lucky on the winning run. So glad to be done with her though. And here's a bad idea for my mental health: going from meter directly to the gank squad. I have nothing to say. I didn't even try to do this fight legitimately. Well, I guess I did try once, but after that I realized that I was just still broken from meter and from my crossbow run of this fight, and decided that I didn't have the patience and just brought in my own squad to help me deal with them. And even with help, it was still much closer than I would have liked. Honestly, I don't know if I'm actually going to legitimately try this fight ever again. Like, it's just not worth it. But anyway, with them out of the way, I think you all know who's next.
Now, the vow will be honored, and my lord brother's soul will return, so that he may be my consort.
Radahn is the man who's had me on the ropes since this DLC came out. His unique combination of speed and power has stretched this game to its breaking point, and even now, 2 months into Shadow of the Erdtree's life, he hasn't really been touched. So as you could probably tell by that line, I did this run and recorded the script back in August of 2024. It is now the end of November 2024 when I'm finally getting around to trying to finish up the edit for this. So some of the things that I'm going to say are probably a little bit wrong given the current patch state of Elden Ring. However, I wrote this in the state in which I did the run. So because of that, I don't feel like it's really necessary to rewrite it, and I think it could serve as a nice little time capsule of how I viewed the game, and I think how many people viewed the game back during that period. Please try to keep that in mind while Radahn absolutely destroys me during this segment. Thank you. Now back to the run. I'm gonna look real stupid if a patch comes out by the time this gets edited. My point is, though, Radahn is a special breed of BS that it seems will never get truly fixed. And yes, despite what some people who will inevitably make comments might say, this boss needs to be fixed. Just a bit, though. I mean, have you seen this man's actual hitboxes? Full credit to Snowshoe for this recording, but these hitboxes are just nutty. I understand the need to make hitboxes just a little bit larger than they probably physically would be for the sake of good gameplay, but this absolutely reeks of a lack of player consideration. Not only are the hitboxes for the arms and the swords about 4 times larger and slightly longer than they intuitively should be, but the arms are treated the same as the sword for dealing damage, which feels doubly unfair. Yeah, I know taking an elbow to the face would hurt, but probably not as much as a 1,200-pound sword to literally any part of your body. What I think might have happened here is that they designed Radahn's moves, fully implemented them with reasonably sized hitboxes, and then realized that they made this man way too large to actually hit the player, if that player decided that they wanted to sniff Radahn's knees for a living. So to compensate, the dev team decided to just use the scale tool, I guess, but very haphazardly. In my headcanon, they were near the release and panicking a bit as the deadline was quickly approaching, possibly on the final day just before certification and just before going home for the weekend, and this is what they came up with. This is the only reason I can think of for why Radahn's single, unforgivably awful, undodgeable cross-slash move exists as it does today. Simply because it was designed in an environment where it could be dodged. Perhaps with smaller hitboxes, you could low-profile it very easily, probably too easily. Or maybe, instead of scaling up his hitboxes, they cranked up the value on his tracking ability. Because we all know you can't just run around this guy's swords the same way that you can with so many other hitboxes in this game. He just follows you too well. There's probably dozens of reasons why this move could exist as it does today. I'm not convinced that this was done deliberately, but as far as I'm concerned, the decision to leave it in this state is done with intent. I don't know, maybe that's too conspiracy-brained, but I guess we'll see in a few months when FromSoft declares this release fully complete as far as their responsibility and maintenance concerns go. But until then, this is our hell. And pardon my French, but c'est juste stupid. Large hitboxes are one thing, but undodgeable moves are another thing entirely. Anyway, I talked about this cross-slash quite a bit more in the crossbow video, so I won't go too much more into it here. But this move is 100% the cause of all my troubles with this boss. Everything else, from dodging incorrectly for his many combos, to getting chipped away at by his light beams, from getting caught in an animation when the flashbang spell starts, and to reacting poorly to his meteor attacks, are all manageable with practice. But for the life of me, I still cannot figure out this cross-slash, even when putting like 90% of my brain power into trying to figure it out because I've already figured everything else out, at least to a certain extent. I even went out of my way to try the things that might make dodging it more possible. I went to grab the Crucible Feather Talisman from the Arza hero's grave outside of Leyndell for extra dodge frames. It was a surreal experience fighting Radahn with this talisman equipped because it felt like I was avoiding damage in so many instances where it felt like my timing was off just enough to get me punished in normal circumstances. But still, the extra 6 frames that this gave me wasn't enough, even when dodging forward and towards his right foot, as advised by every source that I've found. And the fact that this thing increases the damage you take by a full 30% makes it such a hard tool to even care about using in an environment where I'm already fretting over every little possible hit that manages to connect with my frail little body. As much of a masterpiece that this game is, it feels like a bunch of interns were in charge of balancing half of the spells and talismans that exist with how unnecessarily brutal the downsides for some of them can be. I mean, look at this beloved Stardust Talisman, a tool that not only takes up one of your 4 precious talisman slots, but causes you to take 30% extra damage as a downside for giving you 99 virtual dexterity for the purposes of casting speed. Which sounds nice and might be nice if it didn't cap at 70 and wasn't given to you in a DLC where your player level can easily reach heights that makes getting a more respectable level of casting speed pretty trivial. And that's not to mention the brutality of the bosses that exist here, nor the fact that as nice as the extra frames can be in some scenarios, the casting speed increase you gain from 70 dexterity is pretty minor at the end of the day. Why does this exist? Who made this? Who is this for? Stop it, I'm begging you. And now that I'm recording this, I guess it could be kind of useful for challenge runs where you want to be at level 1 and cast a very long spell for some reason. I don't know. Whatever. I got off track. My point is, as nice as the Crucible Feather was in some ways, the damage negation penalty it gave was far too harsh for me to want to continue using it. I could have probably learned the backstep technique with another Crucible Talisman, but I kind of want to be rolling instead of backstepping for maximum damage anyway, and I'm not quite interested in turning my muscle memory into hamburger meat for a gimmick that shouldn't even exist. And I'm not even convinced that it'll even work in Phase 2 with the light beams going off. So as interesting as that experiment ended up being, I abandoned it pretty quickly. The extra damage just never felt worth it to me. But I did have another trick up my sleeve. Throughout this run, I kept putting all my extra levels into endurance. My hope was to reach a level of weight capacity that could grant me a fast roll while still fully equipped. I looked up an Elden Ring equipment calculator, and unfortunately it seemed that given my equipment, it wasn't possible to get there. But I was willing to experiment. Azur's staff is nice, but lighter staves exist. I don't really want to get rid of my icon shield because of its passive regeneration, but there are seals in the game that have 0 weight. And after playing with things a little bit, it turns out that with a 0 weight seal and a quick respec up to 98 endurance, that's just enough to reach that light roll threshold. I missed out on some base defense stats with the extra strength and arcane points, but I'm not convinced that those do much at this level of enemy damage output anyway, so away they go. And after all of that, I'm not gonna say that the fast roll didn't help, but it's close. It mostly didn't. The best I was able to achieve was an occasional surprising dodge of Radahn's cross slash, and even then, it never felt like it was me that dodged it. It more felt like a fluke or a happenstance of the weird elevations of the arena, and it was still so rare of a dodge that I still got hit by this move more often than not. But an increase of 1% is still an increase, and there wasn't any compelling reason to respec again, so this is where I was at. It was already pretty late at night by the time I hit that respec for the fast roll, 1:30 a.m. if the timestamps on my recorded files are to be believed. And before you say, oh, you're a YouTuber, 1:30 a.m. should be nothing for you, you have to remember, this isn't my full-time job. I have a 9 to 5 where I have to go into an office during the week. 1:30's late and I'm a sleepy boy. And despite that, against my better judgment, I played for 2.5 more hours that night. Death after death after death after death. While that cross slash was a huge source of my damage and frustration, the bottom line is I'm still not very good at this boss at the end of the day, and I still take chip damage from the occasional attack. Radahn's complete lack of chill means that drinking a flask safely is impossible except during his largest openings or an extreme bout of luck. And those largest openings are the same openings where I want to be casting Mantle of Thorns instead. So even in runs where I felt like I was doing okay, a single bad combo with a panicked reaction is curtains for me.
Lacy gently wafting curtains.
And in those 2.5 hours, this was the best I could do. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty damn tilted from this experience. Something about that cross slash just gets under my skin. Like, with the pedigree that FromSoft has for tough but fair design, and even as far as they've pushed everything with their design of so many of Elden Ring's bosses, this feels like a step too far. A cross of that fair line to end in a territory that punishes the player instead of earnestly asking them to improve. Every time this attack is chosen by the boss's AI, it feels like a deliberate act of disrespect towards the player. Again, that language sounds pretty extreme, but it's just kind of what it feels like in the moment. And issues like this are punctuated by the relative extremity of these challenge runs. With the level of skill that I've built up against this boss, any normal weapon will be a cakewalk at this point. It's the low amount of damage that I'm capable of that allows Radahn to pull this move out more over the course of an extended boss fight. And that, in turn, makes it more problematic. But it being less of a problem in normal play does not make the problem go away. This run might be a meme, but that doesn't diminish the absurdity of this move and other undodgeable moves. So, it tilted me, and as it got later and later, my body and brain became sapped of energy until I was running on little more than stubbornness and spite, delusionally believing that any run, maybe the next one, would be the one where I would succeed. But that run never came, and finally, at 4 a.m., I called it quits for the night and went to bed, defeated. I'll admit it, sometimes I've got a bit of a problem. Maybe it's ego, maybe it's stubbornness, and maybe it's even a subverted form of narcissism that tells me that this should be easy for me and that I should be doing better. Whatever it is, it pushes me to play for far longer than is healthy. Beyond the point of tilt, beyond the point of exhaustion, and beyond the point that's reasonable. None of that hits me until the dam inside me breaks and forces me to turn the game off and finally get some rest. I wish I could say that this was just what Elden Ring does to me, but this is a straight-up character flaw that's been happening for as long as I can remember. I've done this with competitive multiplayer games like Smite and Smash Bros. And StarCraft 2, and most recently with some of the most difficult bosses in Nine Souls, which is a far more difficult Metroidvania than I ever expected it to be. Sometimes I just don't know when to call it quits, and more often than not, it's to my own detriment. I get frustrated and angry, which causes me to play worse, which causes me to get more frustrated and angry, and creates a cycle that feeds itself. And look, we're all human, we all have our weaknesses, and this is just one of mine. And, well, I'll let past me explain this next part. It's amazing what a good night's sleep can do for you. What seemed impossible yesterday is suddenly within your grasp as your brain processes the information it learned throughout the previous day. The next day, I launched the game, and Morgott was dead on my second attempt of that day. It's funny how the past can repeat itself, and it never ceases to amaze me just how powerful sleep can be. No, not in Elden Ring. The sleep status actually sucks most of the time, but in real life, sleep can be the paradigm shift that's needed to overcome a plateau in your life. Radahn's big meteor attack is a milestone for his fight. I'm not talking about the one that he casts all the time where he floats up and hits you with rocks. I mean the one where he literally becomes the meteor himself. He unlocks this move at around 25% health, and none of my previous attempts managed to reach this final phase of the fight. And the next day, after a good night's sleep and a little bit of self-hype to throw myself into the ring once again, I reached this phase on the very first attempt. I may have immediately died to a cross slash that finished me off after a string of bad dodges from his ultimate combo attack, and as much as that sucked, I knew that I could not let it get to me. Radahn may play dirty, but I know that if I let it piss me off, it's all downhill from there. So, calm and collected, I buffed up and went through the fog gate for another attempt. And initially, it goes well. I still take the occasional hit, sometimes from the usual suspect and sometimes from a poorly placed dodge, but I remain chill throughout the entirety of Phase 1. Not a single flask was used, and somehow I managed to make the attempt feel cursed with an interaction that feels like the game just wants me to fail at this point.
Oh my god, are you serious right now?
Yeah, so, that's bullshit. I guess the times when he's casting some kind of awful effect on the ground is the wrong time to transition to Phase 2. My fault, I guess. I guess I'm the idiot. Whoops, my bad. I guess I better just get good. I think I would have been so salty if this killed me, but thankfully here, it wasn't that big of a deal. I came into this phase healthy, and even though I lost nearly a quarter of my health on this garbage, I'm still feeling pretty good. As is customary for this phase, though, things start degrading over time, and eventually my flask count starts dwindling as I take the occasional hit, both deserved and undeserved, until finally he goes up into the sky. This milestone has what's left of my hair on end. At this point, I still have 5 flasks, which should be more than enough to see this through to the end. But I'm getting nervous, and I've proven by now how quickly I can throw a good lead into the bin. But to my delight, I'm doing good. A minute and a half goes by, and I take a string of bad hits that forces a drink out of me. I stay calm and chip away, when all of a sudden...
Really? Again? I didn't even know he could do this twice.
After this meteor, I'm not okay. Radahn's health is so low that I can taste his death like a wet fart in a small elevator. I'm no longer calm. The anxiety burrows its way into my soul, and I take most of his ultimate combo to the face. Soon after, a brutal cross slash claims another flask, and then another cross slash comes soon after. And then, the unthinkable happens. Okay, I have no excuse for this one. I went against my own established safe patterns and ate the brunt of an explosion of light beams after Radahn's meteor clones, and suddenly, the last of my flasks are gone. You could hear it in my voice how disappointed I am in myself. Why did I do that? I still don't know why I did that. And because of that, at this point, I feel hopeless. But I know that the power of my health regeneration has the ability to keep me alive, as long as I continue dodging. Mercifully, Radahn gives me a well-timed flashbang which allows me to re-up my bestial vitality, and from here on, there's nothing left. No flasks, no second chances. This is it. My first goal is to find an opportunity to mantle up, and after taking a glancing blow from this attack that still somehow manages to hit me on a coin flip for reasons I still haven't managed to figure out, he pulls out the ground break combo that gives me a perfect window to cast. From here, all I gotta do is dodge. Lock in, keep moving, and avoid the moves in the way that you know how. Just as long as he doesn't do that again, I'll be fine. So, I avoid one more meteor clone combo, and then...
Are you kidding me? No! Not again! Oh, I'm so...
So, yeah, he can do that 3 times, probably more. And I was so sure I was dead, but either I was just out of range of the explosion, or I managed to dodge at the exact perfect time, but I did not take a lick of damage from that meteor. Normally after his meteor, I would try to cast Mantle, but I was in such a state of panic and surprise that I completely forgot. But luckily I had cast it recently enough that dodging through his ultimate combo with a couple of extra rolls on top was enough to flatten this giant man for good. Ah! Ah! Oh! Oh!
Oh, thank God I'm recording.
Yeah, so that's the sound of me popping off and then falling on the floor in disbelief and letting all the tension out. I had resigned this attempt to defeat so many times, and yet I was able to pull it off by the skin of my teeth. Time to beat, 18 minutes and 21 seconds. So do you recall when I asked you to remember the time to kill Star Scourge Radon? Time to beat, 21 minutes and 28 seconds. Excluding the ulcerated tree spirit that I fought to get the Mantle of Thorns spell in the first place, Bale the Dread is the only boss in this entire DLC that took longer to beat than a mid-game boss from the base game took without the spell. That's crazy. That's crazy. This spell does so much to help this playstyle that it almost trivializes this run. Almost. Compared to the original Briar Armor only run, and with the exception of just a few bosses, this run was a breeze. Still really difficult, but no 1 hour and 40-minute boss kill marathons like last time. Anyway, I had planned to save Rolana for last for a sort of victory lap, but after everything else that this DLC's bosses put me through, she just isn't interesting enough to spend time on in this video. I should have fought her earlier, my bad. She goes down in a mere 10.5 minutes, and that's when I decided to take on some unfinished business. I skipped Gideon in the original run, and with Mantle of Thorns I went back to take him down for good. Still not easy because his boss fight is absolutely awful when you can't stagger him, but I fell into a good enough groove hopping in and out of his face and managed to drop him after around 16 minutes fighting. Again, longer than just about any boss in the DLC. Next, I went to the Godskin duo, who I'm pissed to say I forgot to record. I don't have any idea how long they took, but it was probably a long time because I remember spending a great deal of time just making laps in the arena waiting for a prime opportunity to do some damage. But they're dead thanks to the Mantle. And then finally, even though she's not on the critical path and I absolutely could have taken her down legitimately without much issue to get my Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, I took down Loretta in a fairly breezy 7 minutes and 15 seconds. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but the funniest thing about this run to me is that before the DLC came out, other content creators got an early copy and made preview videos. I avoided those like the plague so I could experience Shadow of the Erdtree myself with no spoilers, and I'm glad that I did, but some viewers decided to leave me some comments to tell me about how Mantle of Thorns is a thing that exists. At the time, I did some brief research and saw that Mantle lasted around 30 seconds and added around 27 damage to a roll, and because of that, I responded to the comment by writing the spell off completely. What I didn't know was the multiplicative effect of the spell with the Briar Armor, and more importantly, the existence of the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman. Without that talisman, this spell would be a nice boost for a while, but it wouldn't have been as powerful as it was for me in this run. That talisman on its own doesn't quite invalidate the challenge of this run, but it comes pretty dang close. Not having to worry about FP or mind at all is a huge benefit for this playstyle, and the bonus of having permanent bestial vitality cannot be understated. Anyway, I know I'm not the first person to do this run this time, and I'm definitely not going to be the last. With as accessible as this run has become with the existence of Mantle of Thorns and the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, I think that this run is doable for most of you watching, at least for the DLC bosses. Remember, you'd still have to get through Moog without these tools, and that's still a massive chore. But I'm glad to have done this run, and I'm so glad that these new tools exist because honestly, there's a few bosses here that I'm convinced I never would have taken down without them. And at the end of it all, it was actually pretty fun. One last thing, I still have to complete the ultimate challenge of Elden Ring, and if there's any time for me to defeat Melania, it's with this spell. Okay, let's venture into hell. let's go. No, I'm just kidding. Oh no, can you imagine? By the time I beat Radahn, I was pretty much mentally done with this challenge. I could not force myself into a tango with Malenia, even with the Mantle of Thorns. This kill did happen though, without Mantle, by not me, but a person named Serene Laskovsky. Apologies if I butchered your name. As far as I'm aware, they are the first and only documented person to defeat Malenia with only the Briar armor. And as insane as this challenge is, they might be the only person in history to ever do it. After all of this, I just thought that this accomplishment deserved a shout out. Or an intervention, but I'm only qualified for the former, so there you go. Anyway, that's it for this run. Big thanks to all my patrons for putting up with my madness, and I think I'm going to try something a bit easier next time. Give myself a little bit of a break. Shorter video too, probably. Long live the Elden Roll, baby. I'll see you next time.
Violence in movies and sex on TV. Where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? Lucky there's a Family Guy. Lucky there's a man who positively can do all the things that make us laugh and cry.